By request, a look at a game outside the normal purview of Good Nintentions. After all, this series focuses on US released games, and this was a Japanese exclusive. Well, okay, Konami's Biomiracle Bokutte Upa actually has made its way, officially, to the US, but not during the lifetime of its original host platform. Initially released in Japan for the Japan-only Famicom Disk System peripheral in 1988, Biomiracle did eventually make its way to cartridge form. But that wasn't until 5 years later, by which point the NES was on the outs in America, and Konami had better things to do than convert a whimsical cartoon platformer for American audiences. Plus, it would have been a 1988 vintage game up against the likes of Kirby's Adventure and Little Samson, which wasn't really the "we are cutting edge" look that Konami was after. So we in America missed out on Biomiracle until it inexplicably showed up here on Wii Virtual Console in 2008, 20 years after its original debut. It's a pity it took so long because we missed out on a game that, well, feels like 1988 vintage. And I mean that in the best way possible. Biomiracle Bokutte Upa, or roughly Biomiracle Call Me Upa, slots perfectly into the Konami NES legacy, falling right alongside the line of creativity and technical progression the company's games demonstrated during the 8-bit era. Anyone familiar with Konami's NES output could probably peg it as having come roughly from 1988 or so, just by the design and feel of the game. On the most basic level, Biomiracle plays out as a platformer, with your hero, Upa, a baby whose ability to ward off legions of bad guys despite not yet having gained the ability to walk upright, presumably representing the biomiracle of the title, possessing the power to jump and attack. So standard fare, right? Indeed, Biomiracle makes for a perfect representative of the second wave of post-Super Mario Bros. Platformers. Graphically rich, capably programmed, and mechanically experimental. You can definitely see the Super Mario influence at work, as with so many other games of this period. But unlike the janky first wave of imitators, there's an underlying sense of quality and precision that perhaps doesn't quite match Nintendo's best, but certainly holds its own. Fascinatingly though, Mario concepts only serve as the most general baseline of design here. If Biomiracle draws inspiration from any other single game, its greatest influence would almost certainly be Taito's BOBBLE. Granted, on a fundamental level, the two games seem nothing alike. Biomiracle spans nearly 24 side-scrolling stages, rather than taking place across 100 single-screen levels. Likewise, Biomiracle is strictly a single-player adventure, lacking BOBBLE's cooperative play option. And it's light on secrets and mysteries, revealing itself directly and with little room for real discovery. Where BOBBLE and Biomiracle intersect, however, comes in the specifics of how you take on bad guys. Little Upa shakes a baby rattle rather than spitting bubbles, but the net result is the same. Hit a bad guy, and they float. Upa's rattle has the ability to cause enemies to inflate, at which point they begin to rise slowly at a 45-degree angle. Ballooned baddies hover toward the top of the screen and will float there until the rattle's influence evaporates, at which point the monster will burst and fall off the screen. An inflated enemy here works a lot like a BOBBLE monster captured in a bubble. Rattling a foe removes it as a threat, rendering it incapable of attacking and leaving it in a neutral state until it bursts and vanishes. On top of that, you can use an inflated enemy as a platform to allow you to rise to a higher level of the screen, or to ride across open areas. You can strike multiple bad guys in succession to create functional platforms across vast empty spaces, something effectively mandatory in later stages. And as in BOBBLE, your standard attack has no effect on bosses, forcing you to use your powers against them indirectly. With BOBBLE's final boss, Super Drunk, that meant bursting bubbles containing electricity in order to fire beams to injure your foes. Here, you use inflated enemies themselves as projectiles. By pushing against a floating monster from any direction but above, Upa will send it flying in the direction of the push, where it will continue ahead in a straight line until it collides with the scenery. You can definitely see a glimpse of Super Mario here, as flying enemies work rather similarly to punted Koopa shells. They'll take out all monsters in a line, and once they strike a wall, they'll rebound back in the direction they came from. And, like Koopa shells, they pose a definite threat to the plucky young hero, forcing players to be mindful of their movement. Unlike Koopa shells though, you can push a bio-miracled bad guy in one of 5 different directions, including a 45-degree angle upward. And in stages where you're forced to dig through scenery, a monster in motion can save you some time by breaking through those soft obstacles. Turning inflated enemies into projectiles is the only way to beat bosses in this game, and most stages end with either a pig-like mini-boss or else a more imposing threat that serves as the boss for the end of each 3-stage world. Conveniently, bosses tend to barf out a seemingly endless stream of standard enemies, so most fights amount to dodging their attacks and turning their minions against them. Like I said, you can definitely see a number of influences being worn on Upa's tiny size 6T sleeve. Besides Super Mario Bros. And Bobble, you'll probably also be reminded of Super Mario Bros. 2 when Upa starts digging through the earth in World 2. It feels almost like Konami's folks saw the desert stages in Doki Doki Panic and said, right, let's do that one better, and so they did, or at least tried. Instead of simply digging down here, Upa can dig in all directions. The physics of these areas don't make very much sense, as you don't appear to be affected by gravity, even though you see the action through the same side-on perspective as the rest of the game, but it's a good effort. There are also a couple of swimming stages to go along with the obligatory ice levels, and the controls and physics here feel pretty similar to the swimming areas of Konami's own 1987 platformer adventure, The Goonies 2. In other words, Biomiracle Bokutte Upa borrows a lot from some great games. And since these elements all come together under the watch of one of Konami's talented NES development teams, the result is pretty solid. No, it's not one of the absolute greatest Famicom games of all time, but it's a definite top 10%er. And in one sense, it almost feels a little bit ahead of its time. The visual style here feels almost like the prototype for Kirby's Adventure, full of color and a whimsical focus on food. Which isn't of course true in the most technical sense, since Kirby was developed by entirely different people. But the fact that a 1988 Disk System game could even hint at one of the most sophisticated NES games ever is no mean feat. Upa battles through worlds composed of objects that seem to tie into the obsessions you'd expect a child to have. Candy, fruit, milk products, toys and Lego blocks, school supplies, and, for some reason, computer chips. The stages grow more complex in design as you advance. There's a sort of dual-level structure in place from the beginning, with Upa capable of advancing along a lower route or riding enemies up to a high road. A bit like a simplified version of Sonic the Hedgehog's multi-tiered designs. Further along, though, you begin to encounter traps like collapsing platforms and conveyor belts. The game never entirely doubles down on its mechanics. There are sections that can only be crossed by riding inflated enemies, and certain bosses require some precise manipulation of Upa's enemy-tossing power. But that's about as far as it ever goes. While fun, it's fairly breezy, which keeps it from entering the absolute upper echelons of 8-bit gaming. Then again, maybe it's silly to expect a platformer, starring a baby, who can only walk when abetted by his invincibility power-up, to be an exercise in intricacy. If anything, the versatile enemy manipulation mechanics seem a little bit above Upa's grade level, making this a sort of spiritual companion to Umihara Kawase, where the simple, juvenile appearance belies the sophistication and complexity of the mechanics. That's especially true in stages where the background contains nothing but school supplies. So if I seem to be describing Biomiracle Bokutte Upa in terms of other games, well, it's definitely not the most original or unique release to be found on NES. But it is charming, it's well crafted, and it's definitely fun, which makes it a great choice for anyone looking to expand their NES horizons beyond the standard fare.